In the freezing mist of a winter morning in 1944, in a small village called Lanzerath near the Belgian-German border, a reconnaissance platoon of fewer than 20 American soldiers lay hidden in makeshift foxholes. They had no idea that within a few hours, they would face the spearhead of a major Nazi German assault, a fateful encounter that would turn this small American unit into a deadly bottleneck, halting Hitler's bold winter counteroffensive. What exactly happened in Lanzerath, and how could such a small American force stop the advance of a powerful German army? To find the answer, we must turn back the clock and revisit the historic Battle of the Ardennes, Germany's last great offensive, in the winter of 1944. In the fall of 1944, after the Allies had successfully landed in Normandy and liberated France, the war reached the German border. Hitler was facing total defeat as the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east, while the Americans and British closed in from the west. In a final act of desperation, Hitler devised a bold counteroffensive aimed at reversing the situation on the Western Front. He gathered what remained of his elite units, supplemented them with troops from the Luftwaffe, the Navy, and even teenage boys from the Hitlerjugend to form new divisions. As a result, nearly 300,000 German troops and around 2,800 tanks and self-propelled guns were secretly deployed to the forested Ardennes region in eastern Belgium by mid-December 1944. The operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, would later be known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's objective was to exploit the dense, rugged terrain of the Ardennes, where the Allies had thin and complacent defenses to launch a surprise breakthrough. The main thrust would punch through American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp in Belgium. If Antwerp fell, British and American forces to the north would be cut off, giving Nazi Germany a chance to break the Allied coalition. The plan was wildly ambitious, reminiscent of the risky strategies once employed by Frederick the Great, a last-ditch gamble to change the course of the war. The timing was no coincidence either. Hitler chose mid-December 1944, when harsh winter weather could ground Allied air superiority. Indeed, thanks to days of heavy fog and snow, German forces were able to mass along the border undetected. This was considered a major intelligence failure for the Allies. They were convinced Germany no longer had the strength to launch a large-scale attack. Field Marshal Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, even asked General Eisenhower for permission to return to England for Christmas, believing the Ardennes front was quiet. No one suspected that Hitler was about to unleash his final counterblow right in the heart of this so-called ghost front. In the early morning hours of the 16th of December, 1944, the Ardennes offensive began. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the silence of the forest was shattered as thousands of German artillery pieces simultaneously opened fire. A 90-minute barrage rained down on American positions, severing communications and plunging the front lines into chaos. Immediately afterward, 3 German army groups, comprising 17 panzer divisions and 13 infantry divisions in the first wave, pushed forward across a front over 140 kilometers wide in the Ardennes forest. The Germans achieved total surprise. Many American frontline units were completely overwhelmed, forced to retreat, or surrounded within the first hour. However, at a few critical points along the front, American troops resisted fiercely, throwing off the German timetable. Lanzerath was one such choke point located right on the advance route of the Sixth Panzer Army, led by Field Marshal Sepp Dietrich in the northern Ardennes. The forested and mountainous terrain of the Ardennes had very few major roads. In the border area between Belgium and Germany, only one main route was suitable for mechanized movement across the Schnee-Eifel range. A narrow 8-kilometer corridor, known as the Losheim Gap. This road passed through the German town of Losheim and into the Belgian village of Losheimer Graben, offering a gateway for German armor to spill into the open plains of Belgium. Hitler had selected the Losheim Gap as the primary breakthrough point for his strongest armored formation, the Sixth Panzer Army. This northern spearhead, commanded by SS General Joseph Dietrich, included elite divisions such as the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, under Joachim Paper, the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, and the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. The mission of Dietrich's forces was to punch through the Lochheim Gap and drive swiftly northwest through the towns of Malmedy and Spa, seize Liège, and ultimately reach Antwerp. This thrust was crucial. It aimed to drive a wedge between the British 21st Army Group to the north and the American 12th Army Group to the south. If successful, the Germans could split the Allied forces in two, mirroring their divide-and-conquer tactics from 1940. But directly in the path of the Sixth Panzer Army's planned advance stood a small village Lanzerath, perched on a ridgeline overlooking the narrow road to Lochheimer Graben. This village marked the western gateway of the Lochheim Gap. Recognizing its strategic importance, the thinly stretched American command in the Ardennes made an effort to station a blocking force there. Ironically, that force turned out to be just a single reconnaissance platoon, only 18 men from the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The U.S. 99th Infantry Division was a newly formed unit, inexperienced in combat, and had just been deployed to the northern sector of the Ardennes, adjacent to the veteran 2nd Infantry Division. Due to the vast and rugged forest terrain, there were still unguarded gaps between the two divisions. 2nd Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, a young officer only 20 years old, was tasked along with his Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, I&R Platoon, from the 394th Regiment, 99th Division, with patrolling and covering one of those gaps. Normally, a reconnaissance platoon is not a frontline combat unit. Their primary mission is covert surveillance and gathering intelligence on enemy movements. Yet, in early December 1944, Bouck and his 17 men were ordered to dig in and set up a defensive position on a hill near the village of Lanzerath, right on the forward line, in an area presumed to be quiet. They became the only American infantry force stationed at the critical western gateway to the Lochheim Gap, a highly dangerous position manned by a severely understrength unit. Bouck's platoon had only 18 men instead of the standard 25, as some soldiers had been assigned to other duties. Despite the shortage in manpower and limited equipment, the young soldiers worked to fortify their position as best they could. They made use of existing foxholes along the hillside behind the village, dug additional shelters, each big enough for 2 or 3 men, and reinforced them with logs to withstand artillery fire. In front of their line was an open field, roughly the size of 2 football fields, with a barbed wire fence stretching across the middle, meaning any enemy who tried to cross in daylight would be fully exposed. We all felt the position was extremely vulnerable because of how few of us there were and the open terrain, recalled Sergeant Sam Jenkins, a veteran of the platoon. And we didn't have a lot of weapons either. At the time, the platoon's firepower was modest. Each soldier carried an M1 Garand or a carbine, supported by a single light, Browning machine gun, 30 calories, and a few BARs. They had no anti-tank weapons, no mortars. Realizing their lack of firepower, Lieutenant Bouck came up with a creative solution. He used some confiscated German ID cards to trade with a regimental ordnance officer and obtained a lightly armored jeep equipped with a heavy 50 caliber machine gun. Bouck personally drove the jeep into position behind the main line and placed it near the center, behind the foxholes, to serve as a mobile fire support platform. With the addition of this powerful 50 calories weapon and ample ammunition stored on the vehicle, the platoon's firepower was significantly bolstered. Despite a growing sense of unease, Bouck and his men could not yet imagine the storm of fire about to descend upon them. In the days leading up to December 16, they had heard the rumble of vehicles, the clanking of tank treads echoing through the night from the German lines, and had even captured several enemy scouts. Bouck reported these warnings up the chain of command, but they were largely dismissed. Headquarters still believed that a major attack in the Ardennes was unlikely. The only order Bouck received was to hold the position, and that was exactly what they did, hold the line at all costs. At 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December, 1944, the sky was still pitch black, when German artillery suddenly unleashed a storm of fire on the American positions. Bouck's entire platoon huddled inside their bunkers, bracing for the brutal barrage. From deep behind enemy lines, German guns fired continuously for 90 minutes, shaking the ground and tearing apart the surrounding forest. Fortunately, thanks to the platoon's well-reinforced dugouts, no one was injured by the shelling, though the shock left many of them dazed and shaken. By around 8 a.m., as the dim light of a grey winter morning began to spread, the first German soldiers appeared. Emerging from the tree line at the base of the hill, an entire company from the 1st Battalion, 9th Parachute Regiment, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, formed up and began advancing toward Lanzerath. Dressed in paratrooper uniforms and steel helmets covered in camouflage netting, the German troops trudged silently through the deep snow into the open field ahead. Bouck immediately phoned regimental headquarters to request artillery support, providing coordinates for the advancing enemy. But the response he received was cold and frustrating. They were outside the 99th Division's artillery support boundary, and the guns were already committed elsewhere. The 18 American soldiers were now on their own, completely alone, against hundreds of advancing German troops. Lieutenant Bouck calmly observed the approaching enemy through a narrow slit in his bunker. He quickly realized they were outnumbered at least 20-1. A young private, Risto Milosevic, blurted out nervously, "Oh God, the whole damn German army is out there." Still, no one abandoned their position. Bouck radioed command again, asking whether they should fall back to the main defensive line or hold their ground. The answer was firm: hold at all costs. That clear order sealed the platoon's fate. They would make their stand at Lanzerath. Just then, a jeep arrived at the American position. Inside was artillery forward observer Lieutenant Warren Springer and his 4-man FO team, who had happened upon the scene and heard the sounds of battle. They asked Bouck if he needed support, and without hesitation, he directed them into vacant bunkers to bolster their firepower. That brought the total number of U.S. troops on the hill to 2,218 reconnaissance men, plus the 4 artillery observers. Still, when compared to the enemy force nearly a full battalion, they were hopelessly outnumbered. Meanwhile, at the base of the hill, the German troops were still unaware of the American ambush awaiting above. A group of German officers stood casually by the roadside, unfolding a map across the hood of a vehicle to discuss their attack plans. The Americans had already chambered their rounds. Every rifle and machine gun was ready, awaiting Bouck's command to open fire. Suddenly, from a house by the road, a blonde-haired girl, about 15 years old, came running out and called out to the German officers to say something. Through his scope, Bouck clearly saw the Belgian girl standing in the middle of what would soon become a deadly crossfire. He signaled to the platoon to hold their fire. Everyone held their breath. A few moments later, the girl returned safely into the house. "Fire!" Bouck dropped his hand and shouted the order. Immediately, the platoon erupted in gunfire. Machine guns and rifles from 9 dugouts opened up in unison, raining bullets on the German troops exposed on the snowy field. The roar of gunfire shattered the stillness of the tiny village. Dozens of German soldiers dropped within seconds, caught completely off guard. Private William Tsakanikas jumped up onto the jeep and unleashed the .50 caliber machine gun, sweeping across the enemy formation, tearing through them with armor-piercing rounds the size of dinner plates. In less than 10 minutes, the first German assault was completely broken. The surviving enemy troops fled across the open field, leaving behind a trail of bodies and wounded soldiers crying out in pain. Corpses hung on the barbed wire fence, blood staining the cold snow red. The opening battle ended as abruptly as it had begun. An entire assault company had been knocked out of action by just a few dozen Americans in foxholes. The Americans also suffered some losses, though not directly from enemy fire. During the fighting, 3 of Bouck's men who had been sent back to request reinforcements were captured by the Germans along the way. Another soldier, Private Joseph McConnell, was shot in the right shoulder, but gritted his teeth and continued to hold his position. Aside from that, nearly the entire platoon remained intact after the intense first round of combat. Shocked by the unexpected defeat, the Germans paused to regroup. Nearly 3 hours passed in relative quiet, broken only by occasional sniper fire, but Bouck knew this calm would not last. Around 11 a.m., as he had predicted, the Germans launched a second assault. This time, a larger force, possibly a full battalion, spread out across the snowy field, shouting as they charged with vengeance. Once again, the Americans calmly squeezed their triggers. The 50 caliber machine gun roared to life again, this time manned by Private First Class Milosevic. He later recalled his mindset. "I figured we were all going to die anyway, so I was going to take as many of them with me as I could." From their elevated defensive positions, the Americans once again mowed down waves of German troops crossing the open field. Even so, the second assault proved more difficult than the first. One daring German soldier crawled to within about 20 meters of a bunker and fired a rifle grenade, Schießbecher, through the firing slit. Fortunately, the grenade failed to explode. However, it struck Private Louis Khalil in the face, shattering his jaw in 3 places and forcing his lower teeth up into his palate. Khalil collapsed, unconscious and bleeding heavily. His bunker mate, Sergeant George Redmond, immediately applied sulfur powder to stop the bleeding and did a quick field dressing. Despite the shock and pain, Khalil regained consciousness shortly afterward. He whispered to Redmond, "If things go bad and you get a chance to run, just leave me." Redmond shook his head and replied, "We're staying together. Live or die, we stick it out." The 2 soldiers clasped hands, then grabbed their rifles, and continued fighting with grim determination. In the end, the Germans were once again forced to retreat to the edge of the woods, leaving the field strewn with bodies. After the failed assault, the Germans requested a temporary ceasefire to evacuate their wounded. A German officer approached the hillside under a white flag. Bouck cautiously ordered a ceasefire. The officer asked for permission to bring stretchers up to retrieve the injured, and Bouck agreed. So many Germans had been hit that it took over an hour to carry all the wounded and dead off the field. During this lull, the American platoon took the opportunity to redistribute ammunition, reinforce their positions, and tend to their wounded comrades Khalil and McConnell. In the early afternoon of December 16, around 2 p.m., the Germans launched their third assault. Once again, it was a frontal wave charging across the open field. Perhaps the enemy believed that the Americans' firepower had diminished, but they were wrong. The 50 caliber machine gun lit up the battlefield once more, under the control of Sergeant Bill Slape. He fired so many rounds that the barrel glowed red-hot, and the weapon eventually jammed. Even with the heavy gun momentarily out of action, rifles and bars kept up a steady stream of fire, holding the line. Once again, the German paratroopers were mowed down in the open, either lying flat to avoid fire or retreating into the woods after only a few minutes of combat. However, this time the Americans suffered their first fatality. Artillery forward observer Billy Queen was shot in the abdomen and died soon afterward, with no medic available to help him. Queen, a member of the attached observation team, became the only American killed in action at Lanzerath that day. By this point, Bouck counted his men. 18 were still able to fight, but more crucially, their ammunition was running low. Despite the dire situation, the American soldiers were ready to fight to the end, and the Germans had no intention of giving up. Around 4 p.m., after regrouping and reorganizing, the fourth and final assault began. Having learned from their earlier failures, the Germans no longer charged head-on into the American guns. Instead, they split into smaller elements, using the forest for cover to try flanking and surrounding the position from the sides and rear. Before long, the American foxholes were taking fire from multiple directions. Sergeant Slape spotted a group of enemy soldiers creeping up near the rear of a bunker just 15 meters away. He quickly slipped out and tossed a grenade to greet them, killing the entire group instantly. In another bunker, radioman James Fort pulled the tripwires of several grenades rigged around his position, blowing up a group of German soldiers who had breached the defensive perimeter. The battle had descended into chaotic close-quarters fighting, a brutal and desperate struggle. One American fired the last remaining rounds from his revolver, then silence. No more ammunition. No reinforcements. Bouck's platoon had fought to exhaustion for 10 straight hours. With no other option, Lieutenant Lyle Bouck gave the order to cease fire and prepare to surrender. One by one, the American soldiers emerged from their bunkers, hands raised. They were surrounded on all sides by hundreds of German troops closing in. Remarkably, despite a full day of intense combat, 17 members of Bouck's platoon were still alive, except for artillery observer Billy Queen, who had been killed earlier, though most of them were wounded. Private Sakanikas had taken 5 or 6 bullets to the face, losing an eye, with a shattered jaw and bone fragments lodged in his brain, yet he remained conscious. Bouck had been grazed in the leg by a bullet. Khalil was severely wounded in the face. McConnell had been shot in the shoulder. Many others were utterly spent and barely able to stand. As for the Germans, the exact number of casualties is unknown, but historian Anthony Beevor later estimated that over 400 German soldiers were killed or wounded at Lanzerath that day by Bouck's tiny platoon. When the American prisoners were marched past a local tavern in the village, they saw wounded German troops lying everywhere, groaning in pain, while the American soldiers, though badly injured themselves, sat quietly. Milosevic later remarked, "We were in agony, most of us shot up pretty bad, but nobody made a sound." Meanwhile, the so-called master race downstairs was screaming their lungs out. Even after capturing Bouck's platoon, the Germans couldn't believe that just one American unit had held off their elite battalion for an entire day. The commander of the 9th Parachute Regiment insisted that there must have been a full battalion or even an entire regiment of Americans hidden in the woods around Lanzerath. He refused to advance any further that night, ordering his men to dig in and wait until morning to scout ahead, just to be safe. That decision, inadvertently, caused even more delays in the German timetable. It wasn't until the early dawn of the 17th of December 1944, around 4:30 a.m., nearly 18 hours behind schedule, that the lead tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Division, under Joachim Paper's command, finally rolled through the village of Lanzerath and resumed their push westward. The entire timetable for the German advance toward the Meuse River and Antwerp had been set back by almost a full day. Rage swept through the German high command. Paper himself drove to Lanzerath that night to berate his subordinates for the unacceptable delay. When he learned that the obstacle that had stalled them for a whole day had been merely a single American platoon, he was left speechless. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck's small platoon accomplished what was nearly impossible. Though outnumbered 40-1, they held off the enemy for an entire day during Nazi Germany's largest offensive of the war. The 18-20-hour delay they caused completely disrupted the momentum of the German main thrust in the northern sector. Hitler's plan had called for armoured spearheads to swiftly capture key bridges over the Meuse River before the Allies could react. However, at this most critical axis of attack, Piper's tanks did not manage to leave the Lanzerath area until the night of December 17, more than 12 hours behind schedule. The German strategic advance had effectively stalled right out of the gate. Across the 140-kilometre front, the northern shoulder of the Ardennes was the only sector where the Germans failed to achieve their objectives. As historian Hugh M. Cole wrote, "The northern flank of the Ardennes front became the bottleneck for the entire campaign. Had the Americans collapsed there, the Germans could have swept through and captured the enormous supply depots at Liège and Spa, and perhaps changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge." In reality, the determined resistance of Bouck's platoon and nearby American units bought crucial time for the Allies. During the window in which the Germans were held up, the US was able to rush mobile reserve divisions into position, specifically the US. 30th Infantry Division and 3rd Armoured Division, along with elements of the 82nd Airborne, were quickly redeployed to the front. As a result, just days later, these forces coordinated a counterattack and successfully blocked Piper's armoured column near the Amblève River by La Glaise. Paper was forced to dig in, then abandon his tanks and retreat on foot by Christmas 1944. In the end, the Germans advanced no farther than roughly 90 kilometers, less than half the planned distance to Antwerp, utterly failing in their strategic objectives. Their losses were staggering. Piper's force alone started with nearly 5,000 men, but fewer than 800 made it back by the end of the campaign. Hitler's dream of a winter counteroffensive had collapsed. The contribution of Bouck's tiny reconnaissance platoon at Lanzerath to that outcome was enormous, even though they had no idea at the time. After their surrender, Bouck and his men spent 4 grueling months in POW camps before being liberated at war's end. They returned home carrying wounds and traumatic memories, believing their mission had ultimately failed. After all, they had been captured. Bouck himself felt guilty that he hadn't been able to fully protect his men. Only years later, through military records, did they come to understand the true significance of their courageous stand at Lanzerath, that their small platoon had stopped an entire German division and delayed the enemy war machine by nearly a full day. As historian Alex Kershaw noted, had they not stood their ground and bought those 24 hours, the Battle of the Bulge might well have ended in a major German victory. After the war, there was a time when the heroism of Bouck's platoon faded into obscurity. Official U.S. Army histories initially mentioned the battle at Lanzerath only in passing. It wasn't until the 1960s, thanks to the persistent efforts of veterans from the platoon and several historians, that the story of 18 against 500 began to receive recognition. The review process took years and even required a special act of Congress to waive the statute of limitations for military awards. But eventually, the platoon's extraordinary sacrifice was formally acknowledged. On the 26th of October 1981, at the Pentagon, 14 of the 18 surviving members of the 394th I&R platoon gathered to receive their long-overdue honors. The entire unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, and each soldier received individual medals for valor. The 394th Reconnaissance Platoon at Lanzerath became the most decorated American unit for its size in the entire U.S. Army during World War II. Only by revisiting the brutal hours at Lanzerath can one truly understand why this place became a deadly bottleneck in the Nazi war machine. Even the most well-crafted strategy can fail because of small, overlooked obstacles on the ground, and Lieutenant Lyle Bouck's tiny platoon was one such fateful obstacle. They proved that courage, determination, and resolve can turn a small force into a formidable adversary, capable of derailing an enemy's grand designs. 18 young American men, in a moment of life and death, wrote a heroic chapter of history, not only fighting for their own survival, but unwittingly carrying the weight of an entire campaign on their shoulders. And through sheer bravery, they halted the enemy's advance and helped bring about the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II.